Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I forgot to unmute the microphone. Tonight I am going to be taking you through some really common opening mistakes that I see from a lot of beginners, and we're going to go a little bit beyond just that simple, develop your pieces, opening principles, control the center, castle or king. I'm going to step sort of one step beyond those and get into some really specific things that I see a lot of beginners and a lot of amateurs falling into when they sort of are just blindly relying on these principles. I see a lot of games sort of go the same sort of wrong direction when beginners are sort of blindly just saying, yeah, I'm following the principles, so life is good. And that's going to be the topic tonight. It's going to be about some really common mistakes and how to avoid them, sometimes even how to counter them if you find yourself playing an opponent that is falling into these mistakes themselves. So let's flip on over here to the board. I want to start off with a game I've actually shown before. This is, for longtime viewers of the Road to 2000, I think a game that made an appearance in one of the very first episodes. And I want to show it again here, sort of in a new context. But before we actually jump into that game, I want to start with something that isn't really a game, just sort of an introduction to the idea I'm going to be talking about. So a lot of amateur level games start like this, right? White goes e4, black goes e5, white develops this knight to f3 because they've been told it's good, it attacks the pawn, it develops a piece, but black is wise to these ideas, and black usually finds the way to defend the pawn while also developing a piece with knight c6. White might then opt to develop the bishop. Black might also develop out their knight to f6, attacking this pawn, but white, having the advantage of the first move, has the bishop outside the pawn chain. They might play d3 to protect the pawn. Black might play bishop c5. White might play a move like bishop g5. Why not develop the bishop out to g5, pinning the knight? Black might play the very natural d6, continuing development. We might see knight c3. And I'm willing to bet, if you're new to the game of chess, this is a position that you've either seen before exactly, or it looks very, very similar to many, many positions that you have been seeing. That you can argue about stuff like the fried liver attack and things like that, but for the most part, the games aren't going down the path of the fried liver. This is sort of the position that you're going to get. When you're first starting out of the game of chess, you start with the king's pawn opening. Black often just responds in kind if they are a beginner as well. Both sides develop their pieces out, and things seem to be going okay. So at first glance, it might be like, yeah, this is the opening of a chess game. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. And then both players will keep developing, they'll get castled, and life is peachy. Then they go on, they play a very normal chess game, somebody blunders a piece, and the game ends. But I'm here to tell you that black is actually in a lot of danger in this exact position. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean if black doesn't play one of a couple very, very, very specific moves, then black is just going to be lost out of the opening on move 6. So what is white's threat, chat room? Can you tell me, what is white threatening to do here? What is the idea? So Chess King has the right idea here. The idea is to push through with the move of knight d5. So if black were to play some sort of nonchalant move, like kingside castles, white's going to play knight d5. And this is the first idea that I want to talk about. Ideas relating to this early pin of this knight on f6 to the queen on d8. Now, if you're a beginner chess player and you haven't ever lost a game like this, then kudos to you, because I think everybody at some point in their chess career has lost a game to this exact idea, right? You start out playing the king's pawn opening, you go e4, e5, next thing you know, your knight on f6 or even on f3, this can go both ways as well, is pinned to your queen, and you have no good way of stopping it. But if you're really a beginner at chess, you might not understand what the big deal is, right? Sure, the knight's pinned, but it's defended by the pawn and the queen. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is if, let's say we were to continue the game with some developing move like bishop e6, the problem now is that black's kingside is going to be totally fractured, after g takes f6. And this is going to be a winning advantage for white, and we're going to see this exact idea in our first game. But I just wanted to introduce this idea sort of in its most basic form. You sort of achieve this type of position just by very natural development, very normal looking moves that I think everybody has seen played and played themselves before, right? Just seemingly random developing moves, but somehow, some way, black is in deep, deep trouble here unless black plays, you know, a very specific way. So quickly, before I get into real game examples, what can black do against this idea? Black is, in fact, not just lost in this position. Number one, black has an interesting idea to attack this bishop directly. Now, if knight d5 were to follow, there's a knight takes c4 and a c6. And the point now for black is that he has not yet castled kingside, and the move rook g8 is going to come, and black is better here. Perhaps a little bit more sane is the idea of h6, when after bishop h4, you get something similar, but we don't need to double our pawns. We can, in fact, just sort of launch an attack on the king's side like this. And lastly, if none of those ideas look appealing to you, it's not too late to just play bishop e6 and take this knight on d5. Perhaps this is the worst of the options for black, but this is not going to end up being like a 20 move loss or anything. Black is going to be doing perfectly fine here. Okay, so questions on this before we get to sort of a real game. Questions here. All right, well, let us move right along then to our first real game example. So this is a game between two players, Francesco Dunne, who's now actually a Canadian national master, but at the time of the game, I think it was about 10 years ago now, he was about 1500, and he was playing a someone of similar strength by the name of David Zhang. So let's jump into this game between two, you know, not total beginners, but class level players, and see how these ideas are working out in their games. So we have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4. We get a Roy Lopez. Black plays a6, making the bishop move. Oftentimes, black will continue out now with b5. And while these might not be as basic moves as beginners might be used to with just pure raw development, it's still very much in the same vein. Black isn't really wasting time because white wastes the time back by moving the bishop that black wastes by moving a pawn. Black then does get developed with knight f6. We see kingside castles, and now b5. So once again, black wastes time by moving a pawn, but white has to waste the time back by moving the bishop. This is all very normal stuff so far. Black takes some extra queenside space, but it might get attacked by white a little bit later on. But we'll see that that's not even what's going on in this game. Black now continues by developing the bishop outside the pawn chain with bishop c5, still very normal. And then white takes a slightly more conservative approach with the move d3, which it's perfectly fine, right? This is exactly what you would expect to see from maybe a 1500 level game. Neither player making any egregious opening mistakes, both sides controlling the center, aiming to castle, and in fact getting castled after our next move. But, you know, neither player really going deep into theory and trying to prove some opening advantage, right? You just get your pieces in the game, and then life is good. And then that starts to change after white's next move. White plays bishop g5, and once again, we are seeing a lot of the same ideas that we just looked at, right? White is just pinning this knight on f6 to d8, and it doesn't look like too big of a deal yet, but given a couple moves, this could in fact be game ending. This idea right here could be ending the game. In the game, black opts for the move h6, which isn't a bad idea at all. White retreats this bishop, and then we see the move rook e8 by black. So this is where we sort of diverge from known territory. It's actually pretty difficult to get a unique position after 9 moves in the Roy Lopez, but the players have done it here with the move rook e8. And just to give you an idea of how severe this pin actually is, there are in fact a few games in this position. In the highest level game between someone by the name of Dunne and Vladimir Georgiev, which is maybe a name that you recognize. Georgiev's a pretty strong player. In that game, Georgiev played the move bishop e7, which really goes to show how severe this pin can be and how dangerous it can be for black if left unchecked. Black, in this game, Vladimir Georgiev was willing to undevelop this bishop back to e7 just in order to break this pin. And that's, not a coincidence, right? It's not because, black just felt like breaking the pin, felt like the bishop was better on e7. This bishop is great on c5. It pressures the king side, it controls the d4 square. It's really because white was making some pretty severe threats on this diagonal, and they need to be dealt with. So let's see what happens when black doesn't deal with it. Black in the game played rook e8, and white continues now with knight c3. And it's sort of last chance here. Bishop e7 or kind of bust for black. But, that being said, bishop e7 still isn't exactly the happiest move. After you just put the rook on the e-file, it doesn't make as much sense to put the bishop in front of it and stop this rook from participating. So in the game, black tried this idea of knight d4, but this simply doesn't help. Knight d5 by white, and white is just simply much better in this position. Okay, so last chance for black to try to escape was to do something super crazy, super wild, like g5, and probably white's going to end up on the better side there, because g5 with the king castled is going to be a little bit weakening. But in the game, things just totally collapsed. Black captured on f3, white brings in another attacker to this knight on f6, and now this bishop comes back to e7 anyways. But at this point, white is already able to get a winning advantage. So you guys at home, go ahead, take a second, try and find white to move and get a winning advantage here. It's not some big trick or anything, but it is useful to try and find it for yourself. So go ahead and take a moment here. So what you guys come up with? Also, yeah, hello to everyone. Hello, Peter Peterson, Andy Wall. What about the free e-pawn before d3? Okay, so I sort of skipped over that. I can go back and mention that as well. Take with the bishop first, then knight checks. So yeah, there are really no wrong answers here, but the key is to understand that white's main idea is to force this pawn to f6, and you can do that by taking on e7 with the knight. You can do that by taking on f6 with the knight. You can do that by taking on f6 with the bishop. All three of these moves are great. And in fact, it's not even too late for white to go for queenside counterplay, but keeping in line with the lecture, the most permanent damage you can do to black's position right now is just to immediately capture. And that's what white did. White opted to take on f6 with the knight, but like I said, you could take here, and then take here. You could take here first. You could take here first, as in the game. All of these moves lead to the same end result. Black would definitely not be interested in keeping pieces on the board here. The more pieces on the board, the harder it is for black to protect this king. For example, already queen g4 check is just going to be winning the game. This king is just too shelterless, and the sneaky bishop on b3 is going to be a nice attacker as well, with queen h5, queen f7 threats coming. So after takes, we see bishop takes by black, and white should not sort of duck out of the way now. We take back. Black takes with the queen to, again, get rid of the queens before fracturing the pawns. And then white does, in fact, just trade the queens here. And this is sort of, at its base form, the least white could be getting from this fractured structure by black, right? White isn't making any checkmating threats anytime soon. But that being said, the structure is so bad that white is, in fact, winning the game anyways. So see if you guys can find the continuation here. Now you have made the weakness because black has fallen into this very, very common beginner opening mistake of allowing this pin on the f6 knight to become too severe. And now it's time to find the follow-up. How can you actually attack these pawns? So white to move here again, chat room. What do you have? And yeah, Peter Peterson, Chess King, they all have the right idea here. It is to push with the move f4. Pippinchuk says g4. I'm not sure if this is a typo, meaning f4, or if he means g4 to just sort of keep these pawns at bay. In this case, g4 just isn't really necessary. f5 isn't going to be a good response to f4, and we just want to immediately open up this file and get at the pawns. So f4 it is. And now black is just lost. There's really nothing else to say. Black is dead here. In the game, black tried rook e7, so we'll look at that first. Now white simply captures on e5. Black captures back on e5, and it's true for the moment that black is not losing a pawn, but believe it or not, white can actually take immediately and follow up with rook f1, and black once again finds himself in an unfortunate pin. In the game, Francesco chose the slightly less severe rook f6, with the simple point of continuing with rook a to f1, and the pawn on f7 is going to fall anyways. What else could black have tried, though? Perhaps king g7 was a better try, but again, white can simply open things up on this f-file. Now this would lose, obviously, to rook takes f7, so rook takes e5 should be tried. But again, white's just going to double up, attack these pawns, and black is going to have a very, very difficult time of continuing this game. So rook e7 in the game, and then rook f6, rook a to f1 after king g7 by black. And now bishop b5, white simply takes this pawn on f7, takes back, the king comes up, and white just starts to take all the pawns on the board. Rook c8 tries to defend, now bishop e6 is coming to f5. And after rook h7, I think black had already seen enough and chose to resign the game. So 25 move game before black decided to resign. Why did black pick this exact moment? Well, for one, this rook is attacked, and for two, this is a bit of a tactical threat. So things collapsed very, very quickly here for black. And, I titled this lecture something about, beginner opening mistakes. But these players definitely were not beginners. 1500 level, 1400 level, this is, but a long stretch away from the beginner level, in my opinion. And, this is an interesting idea that I think has shifted a lot. More and more people are calling themselves chess beginners. If you're like 1500 over the board, you're definitely not a beginner in my book. You know some stuff about chess. You sort of know what you're doing. But still, these beginner opening traps are definitely going to find themselves making their way into your games, unless you are sort of hyper vigilant, looking out for those. So now that I've shown sort of this intro of the idea and a game where it worked very well for white, I want to show an example of how things might not go so well. Pippinchuk is asking, what do you do after you reach the end of the road to 2000? Do you go to 3000? You take it 100 points at a time. Take it 5 points at a time. Why not? Just next level up. Road to 2005. Road to 2006. Just keep on improving. That's the idea. But anyways, where better to turn to for a refutation of suspect opening ideas than the late 1800s, where suspect opening ideas were abound. And sometimes they still worked out for players back then, but sometimes you ran into a guy like Wilhelm Steinitz, and he would just crush you mercilessly for making these early opening mistakes. So let's take a look here at how Steinitz handled these kinds of early bishop g5 threats against someone by the name of Serafino Dubois. So let's take a look. E4, E5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Once again, we are arriving at the Italian game, otherwise, known as the beginner's favorite opening, because it's just developing your pieces. You play E4, you develop your pieces, next thing you know, you're playing in Italian. Knight f6 was the follow-up by black, and we do again see the move d3. Steinitz plays bishop c5. This should be looking very similar to our intro so far. White went ahead and castled, black plays d6, and next thing you know, we have the bishop landing on the g5 square. So not only is this a game between Serafino and Steinitz, but believe it or not, this has appeared as late as 2019 between players like Wei Yi and Alexander Grishuk. So definitely worth keeping an eye on this position. So chat room, how do you think we should deal with this idea as black? Give me a couple candidate moves here. What are some ideas? It's pronounced with an SH. Steinitz. Fair enough. I thought I was getting points already for saying W like a V, but maybe I'm getting anti-points. I don't know if that's real. The Pedro says H6. Pipichik says Bishop G4, be a copycat. Knight A5 has been suggested. Bishop E6 has been suggested. Castles has been suggested. So there are a lot of moves here that are perfectly reasonable for black. Bishop E6 is actually a perfectly fine move, as we talked about before. Sort of anticipating these knight c3 ideas. The one move that I would say you probably shouldn't be doing is castling here. Like, once you castle, now you're getting into territory where things might be getting dangerous. For example, after knight c3, now really I think your only idea for equality is going to be an immediate h6, and after bishop h4, perhaps already even g5 should be played, because knight d5 is just a scary threat. So castles probably doesn't blow the game just yet, but I think in this position black should be doing a bit better. So that being said, the idea of knight a5 and even the idea of knight d4 are both perfectly reasonable here. But it's important to understand you're not playing these moves sort of blindly. You're playing these moves with the very specific intention of replying to knight c3 with the move of c6. You want to stop this knight from ever getting to d5. Maybe in this case, actually, there's like a bishop g4 idea here for black, but, you know, disregarding these offensive capabilities, it's important to understand that we have some way to stop knight d5 from landing on the board and sort of crushing it. So those are perfectly reasonable ideas. Bishop e6 is fine as well, with the idea that you're responding to this with, again, h6. But I think the main idea here, well, there are two main ways to stop knight d5. The first is this knight move followed by c6 that I was talking about, and the second has to be this move h6. But if you do play the move h6 here, it's important to understand you don't do what Francesco's opponent, David Zhang, did in the first game that we looked at, which is play which is after bishop h4, just sort of giving up and castling kingside, because that's how you can very quickly sort of become worse to these kinds of ideas if you're not being super vigilant. What you do after bishop h4, of course, is continue now with g5, and this is I'm going to say we're flipping the script here, and this is now a very common opening mistake made by players with the white pieces at the beginner level, at the amateur level, even at the world-class level. For fans of Vladimir Kramnik, you know, fans of Vladimir Kramnik or fans of Levon Aronian may both remember a famous game between them in the Candidates, where Levon fell into some very similar types of ideas. So what is the trap that white has fallen into here after the move bishop h4? Well, in openings like the Italian game, like the Giuoco Pianissimo, it's actually kind of important not to castle your king early and follow that up with these sort of moves that induce black to expand on the king side, right? We've been taught a lot as beginners that h6 and g5 is a very weakening idea for black, but in general, you know, weakening the king side isn't as big of a deal if your king isn't sitting on g8, right? Black feels a lot better about weakening these squares when the king is on e8 and can eventually even head to a square like c8, rather than being stuck on the king side where all these weaknesses sort of are. So in this case, yes, black is weakening his own king side, but with these pawn pushes, black is going to be aiming to attack the white king. And the difference between these two kings is that the white king can't leave and the black king can. So in this case, I think black is already doing very, very well, and may even be just significantly better in this position after h6 and g5. So I think this is the best idea here for black. Moves like knight d4, moves like knight a5, they're both playable for black, they're both fine. I don't think black is worse, but this is the best idea, I think, to aim to punish white's opening play. So mistake number one that I talked about tonight was allowing this pin to be sort of too devastating, allowing white to pile up the pressure with knight d5 and come after this guy. And as we talked about it, black has a couple remedies to this. Perhaps the simplest is to move this knight and play the move c6, stopping knight d5 outright. But black in this case has a very aggressive option to try and punish white's play because white has castled early kingside. Because white has sort of nonchalantly followed these principles, black can now launch an attack because white was too careless with the king. And that's exactly what Steinitz does in this game with h6 and g5. Now after bishop g3, Steinitz just continues with the move h5. And this is just brutal stuff right now. This is absolutely brutal. Knight takes g5 cannot be played due to the idea of h4, and the tactics are actually working out in black's favor here. For example, bishop takes f7 is just met by a king move, probably to e7 or f8, and knight takes f7 is a bit of a better try, but even here, it's not going to be enough after h takes g3. This knight is unfortunately never really able to escape its prison here on the king side, and black is going to be just sort of winning. By the way, that's a pin on the king, so don't even think about opening the f-file and counterattacking. Highly illegal stuff. So for example, the simple move queen takes g6, and black is winning in this position. So knight takes g5 not playable, h4 is a threat anyways, so white plays h4 himself, and now black just continues with bishop g4, pinning this knight to the queen and sort of flipping the script here. That being said, well, white isn't just lost outright because white does still have this idea of c3 that we talked about from black's perspective to stop knight d4, and it can and should be played here. Steinitz now continues with the move of queen to d7, just sort of increasing the pressure on the king side. White plays d4, trying to break in the center, but now black sort of has the advantage and is not going to let it go. E takes d4 played in the game, now e5 played by white, but it's too little too late. By the way, this move would not be playable because, once again, the pin is just too strong. So e5 played by white, black takes back in the center, white takes back, black takes back, and now white tries to go for a tactical line to save the game, unpinning this knight by attacking this queen. If bishop takes d1, it would be met by knight takes d7, but black simply saves the queen, not interested in trading queens while we are attacking. White tries the move knight takes g4, but now after h takes g4, the h file is open, and black is going to win on this side of the board. So bishop d3, queen d5 played, b4, and queenside castles, simply offering to sacrifice this piece in exchange just for this devastating attack. Black is just going to deliver checkmate on h1. So white plays c4 instead, but now queen c6, b takes c5 does get played. Now we do see rook takes h4, f3, rook d h8, take queen e8 is sort of a funny move, trying to cut off this king's escape route, and in fact this move is just not very good. But that's okay. It's the late 1800s. They're allowed to make mistakes. The game continues, though, with queen e2 when black is again winning after queen e3. And funnily enough, the e pawn is now doing the job of corralling this king. g3 played. We see check, check, and takes, and check, and takes. And then Steinitz goes on to win this position very easily with eventually an extra piece, and then trading down to the king and pawn endgame. So there was a lot of back and forth in that game a little bit later on, but Steinitz was mostly in control. If you didn't understand all of it, that's fine. I went very, very quickly because this simply wasn't the point of the lecture. The point of the lecture was this opening battle that occurred right here, right after bishop g5, right? Black immediately launches the attack with h6 g5, and this is an idea that you are able to use when white has castled and you have not. This should always be an idea sort of in the back of your mind when you're playing these positions with either color. In positions where black is castled and white is not, this is going to be a good idea. And here, with the colors reversed, it is the correct idea for black. So we've gone through a few iterations now of this idea. To recap, right? We saw sort of the naive variation in the intro where let's say some move like a6, white is just winning out of the opening with knight d5. We saw sort of the 1500 level version of these ideas where black just didn't want to retreat this bishop, felt it was against opening principles, and then still got crushed by the knight d5 idea. And now we see in the late 1800s, this h6 g5 idea is going to be a good one, and in fact was a very good one. Oh, sorry, not with black's king castled, but here h6 g5 is going to be a very good idea, as Steinitz managed to show in this game against his opponent. So questions on this bishop g5 pin and black's various plans, various ways to stop it for white. Questions here before we move on to a second idea. How simple? Princey's not yet. So the game itself wasn't that simple, but the point is that black got a good position with this h6 g5 idea and attacking on the king side. This is a good plan for black, and that's the point. Don't worry if you don't fully understand the rest of the game. Probably it's impossible to understand the rest of the game at the pace at which I just showed it. What's the best reply for white? So that's an interesting question. So let's see. Let's see how Wei Yi and Giuoco did it. So in that game, black played bishop e6 here, it looks like. Is that what happened? Sorry, Lee just did the thing where everything's sort of crazy all of a sudden. So, no, sorry. h6, bishop h4 was played in that game, and then Giuoco didn't go for g5. Giuoco just played a6, so tough to say. Probably, let's see, after h5, I think h4 was fine. I think white actually started off very strong here. And then d4. I think d4 was probably the big mistake. Black is sort of attacking, and d4 kind of assisted black's attack even further. Perhaps more simple developing moves like knight bd2 would have kept white in the game, and maybe white can even start fighting for an advantage if black has played a couple inaccurate moves. So d4 is probably the mistake here. But my advice to you is to just not push this bishop all the way out on g5 when you've castled and your opponent hasn't, because you might get met with h6, and honestly, sometimes bishop takes f6 is just the simple way to go here to make sure you're not falling into any of these sorts of things. If you ever do find yourself with your bishop on g5, your king castled, and your opponent's king still uncastled. Just taking on f6 is perfectly fine for white. But yeah, here I would say the main move is definitely c3, and it's for pretty good reason that bishop g5 isn't getting played on the regular. So other questions? Can white sacrifice the knight? So that's a good question. This is an idea you might have been exposed to before, where white can occasionally take on g5 and win the piece back thanks to this excellent pin on the knight here. But notably, this idea is also only really ever working when the black king is castled. With the king uncastled, this rook is going to turn out to be a very important piece, and white just doesn't have time to add any extra pressure to this knight on f6, while also dealing with this bishop, right? If you take the time out of your day to play something like h4, for example, simplest for black might just even be to take on g5, play bishop g4, play knight h5, and once again, black is going to be launching an attack, and you've really only helped this attack by, number one, sacrificing the material, and number two, opening all the files in front of your king. So definitely not with the king uncastled. Definitely not. Is it safer to play bishop e6 before pushing the h/g pawns? I would argue if you're going for this h6 g5 stuff, it's probably better to do it immediately with the bishop still on c8. If you go bishop e6, then your opponent might just take it, and then you've got entirely different positions to think about here. This is also a very common structure in these positions. Obviously now knight d5 threats are never going to be a concern, but you know, your pawn can be a little bit weak on e6, and there is a centuries-old debate whether over if this structure is good for black or not. And I don't want to get into those nuances here, but bishop e6 is a perfectly fine move. All right, with that, let us move on to idea number 2 that I want to show off. So this one, fans of Chess Network will be well acquainted with. I wanted to introduce a particular attacking idea that's actually related to the idea that we just looked at in the Steinitz game. And that is the idea that you see here in this game. Let's say knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, castles. And then I should mention, by the way, somebody was asking about the free pawn on e4, which fans of the Berlin defense, which is what was played in this game, will understand that it's not so free after rook e1 or d4. White is able to regain the pawn thanks to pressure down the e-file, and then chess is a draw. So that is where the game will end. But in this case, we're going to look at the move knight g4, which is not a very good move, but is a very tricky move. So I honestly think that Chess Network has single-handedly brought this idea to the front of amateur chess. I know I myself, growing up, watched some Chess Network, and all that guy does is scream h2, h2, and that's the idea, coming after the h2 square. So a very natural move for white is to play h3. Say, what are you doing with this knight here? Please go away. You are scaring me by attacking my king side. And now black is going to play the idea of h5. So I wanted to show you this idea sort of in its most basic form. The point here is that once again, white is castled kingside. Black is not, with a rook on h8, still able to attack. And now a horrible, horrible mistake that a lot of people make is to take the knight on g4 when black is going to take back. And now you are simply getting checkmated. Nothing to do against the threat of queen takes h2. If you move the knight, queen h1 is mate. If you move your f-pawn trying to escape, I will go g3. And again, you have no escape. So this is the fishing pole. Why is it called the fishing pole? Because you put out the bait and then you hook them. You hook them. You hook them real good. That's the fishing pole. So now, once again, I want to introduce sort of an idea from the late 1800s. I love these late 1800 games, by the way. If you ever want to learn a lot about the early history of chess, look at some games from the late 1800s. And they will show you the beginnings of these modern chess ideas that we use today. And you get to see a lot of games where the players don't play perfectly. And when one side gets crushed for not playing well, it can be really, really instructive. So with that, let's jump to another big name in history, Joseph Henry Blackburne against the mysterious Lush. I don't know. I think this was a game from a simul by Blackburn, so Lush is sort of a no-name, but we can still learn from it regardless. And this game goes with e4, d5, ed5, queen d5, knight c3, queen a5. So we are now deferring from our e4, e5 sort of study, but we're going to see that the fishing pole does make an appearance here as well. And the ideas used in this game are going to be very useful for our bare bones fishing pole trap that I just showed. And we'll come back to that with these ideas in mind. White plays d4, black plays c6, we see knight f3, bishop out to g4, bishop d3 for white. Blackburn is just developing simply, not trying too hard to go after the queen on a5, and I think this is instructive itself. Well, yes, you're not supposed to develop the queen early because it gets pushed around by minor pieces. On the other hand, it's important not to go out of your way to be targeting a queen. You know, if natural development is fine for you, it can very often just be better to develop your pieces naturally than sort of go crazy trying to attack the queen however you can. So bishop d3, e6 by black now. We see kingside castles and bishop d6. Now Blackburn says, okay, I see what's going on here. Please don't checkmate me. I will ask you kindly to move your bishop. And what does black say? Black says, no, I will not move my bishop, sir. I will play h5. My name is Lush, and I'm here to checkmate you. Right? Lush trying to make his imprint on chess history with this move h5. But we'll see how well it goes for him. We'll see how well it goes. So, chat room, what should white do in this position? What should white do? How do we fight this idea of the fishing pole, right? How do we fight this idea? Give me some ideas, chat. Give me some ideas here. Pippinchuk says, oof, the Scandi, almost as bad as the French. And yeah, I was linked a very funny post by, I think, Jan Gustafsson, where he listed all of the good chess openings for black against e4. And he was like, yeah, you can do this line and this line and this line in the Roy Lopez. You can play the Petrov. You can play a couple Sicilians. And then he was like, anybody who would like to write me an angry letter in defense of, like, you know, the Kalashnikov, in defense of the Dragon, in defense of, you know, a couple other openings. And then he just did not even mention the Scandinavian or the French, because he knows nobody's going to write a letter trying to claim that those are good openings for black. He also didn't mention the Caro, by the way. But okay, chat room, what are you saying? Don't take on g4, and that is correct here. That is correct. So then there are some very good specific moves being mentioned, like knight e4, going after the d6 bishop. d5, disrupting the queen, is pretty interesting as a tactical solution. Bishop b2 was said, maybe bishop either e2 or d2 is what they meant, I don't know. Push the h-pawn was said, h4, okay. So a lot of good ideas. A lot of good ideas here. So what I will say is I don't really agree with the idea of h4. So let's talk about this sort of tension that we have on the king side here. It's true that for the moment, white is not going to take on g4. Taking on g4 would be the horrible, horrible mistake. Well, first of all, this is just immediately hanging. And you get checkmated any number of ways here. Any number of ways. Queen g5, queen h5 might be the simplest. Even here, just queen h5 is simple enough, right? You're getting checkmated just like what we saw. But that's not to say that you don't ever want to capture the bishop on g4. It's very easy to, you know, imagine a day when, for example, let's say somehow this center does get blocked. Somehow some trade like this happens, and then you do want to take this guy, right? It's maybe not in this position either, but you can imagine a day when it might be good to take a free bishop on g4. So it's nice to just leave this little tension here. And notably, black is never able to open the h-file unless you let him, right? He's just not able to open this h-file unless you take on g4. So that's the good thing about the fishing pole, is black is really fishing, right? All you have to do is not take the bait, and then you don't get bit, or you don't get caught, then you don't get caught, right? Analogies are tough. As for the tactical idea of d5, I don't think this is going to be a good one here. I think black can simply take, and you're still not really threatening to take this, because the bishop and the rook are enough at least for a draw for white. But it is an interesting idea to keep in mind, this idea of d5. So let's talk about what else is going on in the position. Number one, we have this tension where we can threaten to take the bishop on g4. Right now it's bad for us, but that's not to say it won't be bad forever. Number two, black is wasting time. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Black is wasting time by playing h5, and he's also committing to not castling kingside. And those are two very, very big concessions to make in order to set this sneaky little trap of the fishing pole. So black is wasting time with h5, and he's sort of owing this tempo on this bishop. Someday this bishop's going to have to move again. It can't stay here for the rest of the game. And on top of that, now castling kingside is going to be difficult to sort of manufacture for black. So what should white be doing against these fishing pole ideas? Well, white should be aiming to open up the center of the board, because that's where the black king is, and white should just be aiming to activate the remaining pieces, right? Black has lost time with this idea. All white does is not take the bait, play good chess moves like knight e4, which has just been suggested, and then the game continues just in white's favor. This idea of h4, by the way, I sort of was arriving at this point, but I don't think I mentioned it specifically. I don't think this is a very good one, because we do want to maintain this threat to the bishop, and it's not as if we're removing any of black's threats by playing h4, right? It's not like h4 was a big threat by black, because then, you know, we are going to take this bishop for free. So h4 doesn't make the most sense here. This position is going to stay closed unless we take on g4. So knight e4 was a great move by white in the game. Black plays the move queen c7. And white just takes this bishop off the board on d6. It's also fine to not do this, by the way. Also, by the way, let's say knight d6, queen d6 is in the game. After these moves, white is perfectly justified in taking this bishop now, right? So already in the game, white could have won by taking the bishop and understanding that this open h file is not going to be sort of the death of white's king here, because we have everything covered. We just have everything covered, and white is just up a piece, right? Queen d4, for example, isn't going to be good enough. We can do a number of things, including simply take this pawn on g4, and white is winning. That being said, that's not what white opted to do in the game, and I think what white did is perhaps even more instructive. White just says, yeah, right, like I'm ever taking this bishop on g4, you have no attack if I don't take the bishop, so white goes bishop e3, and black finally says, all right, what am I doing, and takes on f3, right? Just by leaving this tension here, black eventually realizes, hey, my opponent's not ever taking my bishop, you know, maybe he should be taking my bishop, and they just relieve the tension themselves. And next thing you know, it's like, imagine this position, and then black plays the move h5 instead of any other move. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Black would much rather have this pawn on h7, and this knight on f6, or this knight on d7, or this king on g8, right? Black would much rather have all of these things rather than this pawn on h5. And that's the simple remedy to the fishing pole in the vast majority of cases. You just don't take the bishop, or knight, or whatever piece is on g4. You just don't take it. And then Blackburn continues out with knight f6, rook fe1, rook to the center of the board, knight bd7, c4 by Blackburn, and now after rook c8, we see even more improving moves, rook ad1, and once again, we see black with this dilemma where it's like, do I really want to castle kingside after I played the move h5? In the game, Lush said no, played h4, and this is now the end of the game for Lush. Bishop f4 is the start of the combination here, queen e7, and now white to move and win. It's d5 is the most principled approach taken by Blackburn. Black king stuck in the center, so what do? Bring your rooks to the middle of the board and open up the position. And this game is just everything wrong with the fishing pole, sort of shown in the extremes here, right? Black is making no threats with h5, you just don't take the bishop, and then you open up the center and punish your opponent for not developing their pieces, not castling their king. The game did continue with c takes d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, and then Blackburn found the nice follow-up here of bishop b5. This is a threat now with the rook on the e-file. This knight can't move without problems on d7. Knight f6 was tried, trying to defend the knight, but now bishop d6 forces the queen back to d8, and oof, white to move here, queen f5 is the idea. Black plays queen e7, we see queen d3, queen d8, don't worry about those moves, it all becomes clear what's going on after white's final move of the game. So chat room, white to move and win here. What is it? White to move and win. One last puzzle. One last puzzle for you guys. And yeah, Christian has the right idea here. Rook takes e6, fe6, and queen g6 is mate. And that was the point of queen f5, by the way. I just wanted to show you it in its full glory from the final position. So rook takes e6, and Lush had enough and resigned the game. Queen e7 avoids checkmate for a moment, but, you know, obviously this is pretty busted. So just to recap this game, what happened? Well, black played some very natural moves, then h5, the fishing pole, and Blackburn just wins the game by simply not taking the bishop. So that's the second big idea that I wanted to show. Now with the last 5 minutes, I want to introduce you guys to two players of slightly higher strength than Blackburn and Lush. I know it's hard to believe a player better than Lush, but here we go. And these two players are known by the names of AlphaZero and Stockfish. I think it was Stockfish 8 at the time. Of course, these were earlier versions of both of these engines. I think they've both had some updates now. But I don't have time to analyze this game in its full glory. but I do want to briefly show that these ideas don't just exist in beginner games, in late 1800s games, or even in just human games today. These are ideas that appear even at this super high inhuman level of chess. So just to show, we had a Queen's Indian defense. Don't worry about any of this. This is not an in-depth game analysis, but just to show you h4, h6, and of course now white is just going to leave this knight on g5, threatening stuff like queen h7 mate, and leave this rook on h1. So these ideas appear even in, superhuman levels of chess. What's the difference between this game and the last game? Why is this good for AlphaZero when it was not good for Lush against Blackburn? Well, the difference here is that, number one, white is making very concrete threats on the king's side, pinning down this knight to the f6 square, and number two, white is not sort of losing all this time that we saw in the previous game, right? White had to move this knight to pin this pawn to the bishop, and now white is going to fight back in the center of the board as well. This game continued with knight d5, knight c takes d5, c takes d5, and again, this pawn cannot be captured because this knight is overworked, right? Can't defend h7 and take on d5. And this was a very long and interesting game that, again, I just don't have the time nor willpower to go into here. But the long and short of it is eventually AlphaZero comes out on top, proving that the Queen's Indian defense is a pretty suspicious opening, with threats on the king's side abound. And eventually, winning endgame. What else? What else? How else do you end a game at the superhuman level? So, final questions for me before we call it a night here. Questions on the first idea that we looked at, which was just this idea of this pin on the knight on f6 early on in beginner games, and then this nice little tricky idea of the fishing pole. Questions on either of these things before we call it a day. And I say call it a day. Of course, there are more lectures after this. I am going to be doing an endgame lecture, and Pippinchuk thinks he's noticing a pattern. Thinks he's got me pegged. I'm a rook endgame guy. I've been doing rook endgames for like a month and a half now. I decided, you know what, I've had enough of the rooks. Let's talk about knights. So I'll be talking about knight endgames in just a couple minutes here. So yeah, if you do want more chess, there's another lecture tonight on endgames rather than this more opening focused lecture. All right, that will do it for us then. Thank you guys again so much for watching. As I said, endgame lecture right after this on the YouTube channel. Just click Chess Club and